Hi there, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And today I'm going to just do one video on one person giving his opinions on the war. His opinions aren't just random opinions. He is quite a significant military mind. This is Ben Hodges, who is a retired United States Army officer who served as commanding general for the United States Army Europe. And he was indeed in charge of that, or in that position, during the 2014 Crimea annexation, I believe. Anyway, he's quite ubiquitous in the world of analysis of the Ukraine war. He's a guest on many different shows, and his opinion is always pretty valuable. I don't think I've ever particularly disagreed with him on anything. Not that I'm in a position to disagree with someone with far greater knowledge of these things. Indeed, that would be rather presumptuous of me. But he has talked, or not, but and he has talked quite a lot about Crimea and the importance of taking Crimea, and the fact that that is A, doable, and B, precisely what the Ukrainians would want in a primary objective. It's so crucial to the outcome of this war and indeed to the future of Ukraine. He knows that, so he's often talking about Crimea. So that's one thing that you often hear him mention, and other things are as we shall see. I'm going to play you two interview or sections from two interviews, and in both of them I'll just give a little bit of commentary as well, just to go a little bit deeper maybe, or give you my own opinion on what he's talking about. The first one is an interview on Ukraine, the latest podcast, the Daily Telegraph podcast, and that was aired on Monday, and this is from Times Radio, both from UK news sources. And the Ukraine, the latest piece, I actually recorded some days ago, so that's why I'm going to be dressed differently. So over to Ukraine, the latest now.
One of the reasons I am so optimistic about Ukraine's chances is because of how the Russian general staff, the Russian military leadership, how they hate each other. I mean, the friction at the top levels is, the whole world sees it. And of course, in that kind of a culture, each of them has their own sort of legions of followers, if you will, people that are loyal to this commander, that commander. And so that tribal...
Like ancient Rome.
Very much.
And that was bad.
That's a good analogy. That trickles, the hatred will trickle down to the colonels and the younger officers and the troops, if you will. So one of the things that's most important, we know from thousands of years of history, is that soldiers trust each other. They're not fighting for the flag, they're fighting for their unit. And they have confidence, even if they don't like their commander, they're confident that their commander is doing everything possible to give them what they need to succeed and survive. This kind of incoherence and friction inside the leadership has a debilitating effect on the combat fighting strength, fighting power of these units. And fortunately, it also ensures there will not be a coherent defensive strategy by the Russians.
Now, you believe Crimea holds...
And he goes on to talk about Crimea there, but I've talked to you about that. But I find that really important. I mean, he talks earlier on about Prigozhin being involved so much in Africa and getting money from diamonds and oil or whatever else he's got, whatever other pies he's got his fingers in. And Hodges says that that's probably why Putin hasn't got rid of him yet, because actually he's bringing back quite a lot of money to, well, probably to the Kremlin, to Putin himself. So he has a utility there. So that's why he's able to be pretty critical of the Russian MOD and Putin himself, and still have not fallen out of a window. But so I think it's so important that this tension that exists between the Russian MOD, between Wagner PMC and the conventional forces, and between different units, and the fact that actually so many of these mobilized and conscripted soldiers seem to resent their commanders or resent the people they've been placed under. If they've been placed under the DNR and the DNR sending them to basically be into the meat grinder to sacrifice them rather than their own troops, then you've got this lack of coherence, you've got the resentment of your immediate commanding officers, and there's no coherence, there's no unity, there's no loyalty involved, and that's so super important. He talks earlier about the importance of loyalty in terms of, you're not with soldiers, you don't so much fight for your country. I know it sounds like I'm saying this having never fought for either my country or my unit, but he talks about how it's you really quite often end up fighting for your brothers, your comrades, and they are your immediate kind of uh, ideal, I guess, rather than this whole national ideal for Queen and country in the UK, or for, fighting for the Constitution, America, and the president, or whatever. These bigger ideas up there. Yeah, if you sit down and think about it, but immediately it's all about your unit and your commander and your brothers. But when you look at the Russian forces, and they're not fighting for their homeland and families and friends in the way that the Ukrainians are, and they don't know what they're fighting for, and they have no cohesion, then it all falls apart. And I think that's really really important observation there. And the last thing I'm going to turn to is this idea of center of gravity, and over to Francis Durnley.
Wonderful. And to start, you've been consistent in your view that this war will prove disastrous for Russia. Can you briefly explain the concept of center of gravity and suggest where you see Russia's military center of gravity at this present moment and political center of gravity?
So, of course, the concept of center of gravity was introduced to the military world by Clausewitz when he talks about it's this thing, whether it could be a tangible thing such as a land force or your Navy, or it could be popular support, or it could be industrial power, but it's the thing that gives one side its power. And so obviously, part of the reason he identified that was so that if you're fighting someone, you want to go after their center of gravity, either directly or indirectly, so that it cannot be powerful. For Russia, their center of gravity, and the one advantage that they still have, is mass infantry, mass artillery, and a willingness to spend it. I mean, they clearly don't care how many of their own people they lose, but that's not Putin. It's always been that way. As long as they have mass, they think they still have a chance to win. And I think from a political standpoint, their center of gravity, of course, is Vladimir Putin. He is a 100% total autocrat. I can't tell who influences him anymore, his information, how secluded is he, or how insulated is he?
That's a really good point. I've talked about this a lot before. He's so distrustful of the internet, he doesn't use the internet, which means all his information is curated by other people and delivered to him. He cannot question, or he cannot verify or disconfirm any information that's given to him independently of those people giving that information. You can go to other people, but then even they are curating. When you can use the internet and do use it freely, you can verify stuff. Yes, that is other people, but you get to choose, how you navigate that. But if you are just stuck in your palace and you don't get out there, and you're known to be, very paranoid in terms of COVID and other things, then you are relying wholly on other people handing you folders and curating your information to you. So you end up living in a bubble. This is a really super important point that Hodges is talking about here. And just a little thing like him thinking the internet is a CIA thing and not using it, not having a smartphone, just automatically invalidates him from being able to have a grasp of reality that you or I take for granted in a massive way.
How does he make his decisions? But I think as long as he thinks there is hope that Russia can win, which really means that Western support for Ukraine dries up, I think he will keep doing this because of his willingness to use mass. I think when he realizes they've lost and that they are going to lose, that they're going to lose all of Ukraine, then I think his number one priority will be, saving his own skin and trying to stay in power. So he'll do something else.
So there you go. That's center of gravity as an idea from Carl von Clausewitz, someone whose name pops up incredibly often when talking about military strategy. And yeah, he's a person that I didn't know of 2 years ago, and I certainly know about now. And now onto the Times Radio interview. Uh, let's go for that and see what he has to say there.
I think eventually we will.
We've been hearing for a couple of weeks now that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is coming. Is it coming, and when?
So General Zaluzhny, the chief of the general staff there, is an amazing soldier. I mean, he's very good. I've been impressed with their discipline. We know more about the Russians than we do about the Ukrainians, which is as it should be.
I think it's always good to know that one's own opinion about someone or something is verified by someone who is of a greater standing than oneself. So I think Zaluzhny is brilliant. He appears to be spot on in everything I've heard him say and all the things written about him. And then when someone who is his kind of equal, if you like, and someone who is in a much greater a position and much greater knowledge on these subjects says that sort of stuff and gives Zaluzhny the evaluation that he does, then that's I feel vindicated. But also, that's going to be the case, and it's really important that Ukraine does have this decent commander in place.
But I think this counteroffensive, which everyone feels is coming, it'll happen when they're ready for it too. And I think he has three conditions. Number one, are his own forces ready? Do they have enough strength, armored brigades that can penetrate on a narrow front the dense Russian linear defenses? That's one thing. And so all the work that UK has been doing, the equipment Germany's provided, what the US is doing in other countries, that's what's happening right now. I think they probably are just a few weeks away from being ready in terms of their own strength. The second condition, what about the Russian forces? Have they been degraded enough to give the best chance for Ukraine's attack to be successful? That means destroying ammunition, destroying fuel, creating chaos in the rear area. And then, of course, the third condition is the ground, the trafficability. Is the soil dry enough to be able to support the churn of hundreds of heavy tracked armored vehicles? When those three conditions are set, I think he tells President Zelensky we're ready to go.
And how do you think that will be conducted?
Well, I think you're going to see what we would call combined arms, meaning mechanized infantry, tanks, engineers moving in armored vehicles, artillery and air defense moving along, overwhelming combat power massed on a very narrow front. They don't have to attack the whole 900 miles. They just have to get through these defenses to, I think, the Azov Sea coastline to cut the so-called land bridge. I think that's when it starts, that's what'll happen. But right now what's going on is what we call shaping operations to set those conditions.
And that's nothing particularly groundbreaking there, but it does go towards confirming or showing that that land bridge really is that number one priority. It's going to be the main thrust. But as Thomas Tyner said before, and I've sort of discussed on this channel previously, it's not a case of spreading out a really wide counteroffensive. That's not how you do it, given that you've got an awful lot of defenses built in, fortifications, trenches, dragon's teeth, and all minefields. If you're going to send a wide wave of vehicles and resources against that, then that can all get taken out more easily. What you want to do is find a weakness and punch through there in a very kind of narrow way, so you can punch through defenses once and then exploit that and go behind the lines, and then you don't need to negotiate all those defenses time and time again in lots of different places along there. You punch through in maybe 3 places or whatever, and then everything becomes easy once you punch through once and successfully punch through. You can get your equipment really quickly through that that corridor that you've punched through, and then it all falls into place. And let's rejoin it here a little bit later.
Weapons and equipment will obviously be key to Ukrainian forces in moving forward. But if you were commanding forces on the ground, in preparation for this counteroffensive, what kind of tactics would you be using?
I think what we're going to see, what I would hope to see, is the payoff of training that's been done by the British Army, the U.S. Army, and other allies to help Ukrainian forces conduct a combined arms attack where you integrate tanks, mechanized infantry, engineers that are moving in armored vehicles that will clear paths through the lanes to breach through obstacles, or you've got artillery that is pouring fire down on top of the defenders along this narrow frontage along which they'll attempt to achieve a penetration. And they'll also bring forward some air defense with them, short-range air defense, to help keep away the Russian drones and other responses that the Russians will do. So I would imagine there will be 2 or 3 penetration efforts, and then probably 1 or 2 that are decoys or deception or supporting attacks, so that the Russians can't fix exactly where this is all going to happen.
Which is, again, it's not groundbreaking. This is what we know, that there'll be a number of main objectives, and then some decoy ones as well to throw the Russians off to get them to fix troops in place. But also, if the Russians might think that's a decoy and don't give it enough attention, then that can be a place to exploit as well. So there needs to be adaptation, and there will be adaptation on the battlefield to adapt, or along these operational lines to adapt to what the Russians throw up or what the situation throws up. So if there is a weakness there, you don't go, well, we had planned to go over here, and all our plans say we've got to do that. So even though it's weak there, it doesn't matter. That's just a decoy. You actually go, whoa, okay, interesting. That could give us a greater benefit if we exploit that weakness. And so it might be that all of those attacks, this is like the deep battle doctrine of the Russian army, which is where you attack in lots of places, and then where you find the weakest spot, you exploit that and sort of overrun that. Well, there's going to be could be an element of that for the Ukrainians, which is adapt to whatever it throws up, and if that ends up being the weakest point, then that's where you exploit.
I believe that the potential is there for them to be very successful. There's this saying, if you're not well trained and disciplined and confident, and you hear that the enemy has bypassed you or they're behind you, you panic. Russian defenders will break, because I don't think in most of these trench lines that the soldiers that are there sitting in those trenches and bunkers are well trained, confident, disciplined. And so the potential for this thing cracking open, but I say potential, is very real.
And perhaps not enough people have talked about this. Some people have. Thomas Toner, again, to mention him, has mentioned this, that when we've seen that in certain places, Kuzumivka this last week, and just south of there is Stelmakivka, the Ukrainians counterattacked there, and then suddenly the poorly trained convict soldiers just did a runner, apparently. But you can imagine in these understaffed trenches, because they've done the calculation. We've done the calculations. I've read through threads with you on this channel recently to work out the length of these trenches and when they're deep as well. So you've got first line, second line, third line. And to man all those trenches, you'll need gazillions of troops to man them at a sufficient level to defend them all over those lines. So therefore, they are going to be undermanned, just necessarily so. Trenches are undermanned with poorly trained troops that is up against, as we've seen in some of the videos I've shown recently, the number of vehicles and a number of troops that I think Ukraine might well be able to throw at this counteroffensive. You've got a really strong possibility, like probably much stronger than, it sounds too confident, doesn't it, to say, oh, they will be routed, but there is a really strong possibility that the Russians could be routed. I would be cacking myself right now if I was Russian, thinking, if I've got an accurate understanding of how little capability and capacity the Russians have realistically along the whole front line, I would be somewhat worried. And there is talk about panic in the ranks.
Of course, we know that war, the nature of war is unchanging. It's violent, it's uncertain, there's friction, there's fog. So things could go wrong in some places.
And to address how long this war will go on, there are some schools of thought that President Putin will try and spin it out for as long as possible, perhaps till after the presidential elections in the US. And then there are those that say that what he really wants is a settlement, a deal, a peace deal brokered by the US. Where do you think it lies, the truth?
His only hope, and I do mean the only hope that the Kremlin has, is for the West to lose interest or to get tired or to get distracted by something else.
Absolutely agree. I've said since April last year, I keep banging on about this. I wrote an article saying that Putin can't win. There's no way he can win. What do you do now, Putin? And it's still the same. There's no way he can win. The only way he can, scare quotes, win, and even then, that's really difficult because it's assuming that Ukraine would just roll over and have their belly rubbed, is for this to drag on so long that the West and allies just get bored. But everyone's been very strong and saying, certainly with the rhetoric, saying that we're in this for the long haul, for as long as it takes. But that's his only hope, because he's only got nuclear. Pressing the red button is his only kind of escalation, the only place he can go, because at the moment he's unable to positively affect the battlefield with what they have, and they're not getting anything new, anything extra, anything from other countries, whereas Ukraine are getting consistently they're getting consistently upgraded. So as the Russians get degraded, the Ukrainians get upgraded, and that asymmetry grows. There's no way that he can win. So it's just grinding out this long battle. And if the West do get sort of all in unison, suddenly go, oh well, bored of that, let's do something else, which is incredibly unlikely. You might get that with several countries, but there will be countries that won't do that, I'm sure. You would then get this situation where Ukraine would still be there, and they'd still have all the kit they've been given, and they've still got people willing to fight. So, yeah, you might argue about where they get ammunition from and stuff like that, but then that's going to be the same issue for Russia as well.
That's the only thing he can do. There is no other thing they can do to bring about a successful conclusion from a Russian perspective. And you're right. I mean, of course, they know exactly when the American elections are, British elections are, Polish, and on and on and on. Fortunately, the U.S. election is 18 months away. Fortunately, the U.S. Congress continues to support this effort in a very, very strong bipartisan way. Stand fast. There are 3 or 4 loudmouths on both extremes, but by and large, the Congress is in strong support. So,
which is important. You know, yes, there are these loudmouths, that people that are kind of against the war, or supporting Ukraine in the war, and seem to be kind of almost pro-Putin and pro-Russia. But are they a strong minority? They're vocal, but I'm not sure that they are as representative of the political spectrum as the loudness of their voices might indicate. And that's good news for the US going forward.
So I think if my president, and I have not only great respect for my president, but also he's done a good job. And you got 50 nations sticking together, not just NATO nations, continuing to support Ukraine, but
So he's just about to say, but. So, and I think he's absolutely right here. So I think Biden has done a really good job. I know some of you out there don't like Biden, but from an international point of view, Biden, and by that I mean his administration, right? So let's say Biden's administration has rallied the world to a unity, along with obviously Zelensky himself, but there has been this unity that has reacted against Russia that has surprised everyone, and actually Biden has been really strong there. What he's going to say is he just hasn't said a couple of very key words, which actually I don't think any of the leaders have either. And so there's this question that keeps going on: why don't the leaders say they want Ukraine to win? They say, you know, we want them to prevail or whatever. They never use these very simple words, and it's all about, you know, the realpolitik and the very careful choice of words. But he says that actually that's important. But I think he's right. I think Biden has done a good job, and I think those who really want to hate on Biden are going to hate on Biden no matter what. But in reality, in the reality of this war, he's done a pretty good job.
He has stopped short of saying exactly what the desired strategic outcome should be. You know, and he also has stopped short of saying we want Ukraine to win. Instead, we say things like, "We're with you for as long as it takes." That's not something solid enough to generate the kind of support that's needed to bring about a rapid conclusion.
And that's not because Biden is just being absent-minded, and all the other leaders, by the way. Those are carefully chosen words, and there's a very good reason as far as they are concerned for saying that, and for not saying we want Ukraine to win. And yeah, so as I think he goes on to discuss,
If he were to say we want Ukraine to win, and then Prime Minister would say it, Bundeskanzler would say it, this whole thing could be over by the end.
Is that what you want them to do?
Absolutely. And this whole thing would be over by the end of the year. I mean, because then we would stop coming up with excuses why we can't provide ATACMS or we can't provide F-16s.
Why do you?
and then he goes on. I won't play it, but he goes on to say that she asks, "Well, why don't you think they do say this?" And he says because of the being afraid of escalation and the nuclear problem. But he goes on to say, but they realise that's not really an issue now, so they might as well say this. And I think I broadly agree with him, to be honest. I think now that all the red lines have been reached and Russia have been unable to do anything, you might as well just be really obvious about what we want them to win. Let's give them everything. There you go. And so I do agree with him on that point. Right, the penultimate segment is next.
What do you think is at stake in this war, and how well do you think the American public understand it and appreciate it?
Well, this is an excellent question. So far, I think most Americans instinctively feel like, this is Ukraine. It's not a perfect democracy, but they've only been at it for about 30 years. So we've been at it for 250 years, and we're not perfect. So there is a sense of the little guy and Russia. Okay. I don't think there's a lot of sympathy for Russia, except perhaps on some people on Fox News. Having said that, the burden is on the president to explain why this matters. It matters because this is about American security, because our security depends on Europe's.
This is a really important point, by the way. So there are some people on my threads who say this is Europe's problem. Europe's problem. Americans shouldn't be paying for this. Blah blah blah. As if like America's had nothing to do with Russia for the last 50, 100 years or whatever. This kind of the Cold War, the escalation of the Cold War, and the machinations have not had anything to do with America, and so therefore anything to do with Russia doing what it's doing, and any of the politics of the last 25 years, 40 years have had nothing to do with America in terms of Russian politics. Americans should walk away and leave Europe to it. That's Europe's problem. I could give you all sorts of philosophical, like not even philosophical analogies, kind of moral analogies to that, but you get the picture. Being embroiled in a fight and then walking away to watch that guy punch someone else, and you say, well, it's their problem now, even though you've got them all riled up and stuff, and there's all this going on. So whatever. But actually, as he says, Europe's security is in the best interest of the US. I mean, all the trade that's involved, the export of their own security, as I talked about before, and Perun talks about in his videos about how the US exports security. It's just one of the things they do, and they get a return on investment. And to think that this is kind of like Europe's problem, they should deal with it on their own type thing, is just really, really simplistic. And he gets that, as you'd expect for someone that was in charge of the American army in Europe.
American security, because our security depends on Europe's security. Our prosperity depends on Europe's prosperity, and all that requires stable, secure Europe. Energy supplies, supply chains, refugee problem is not so great there. People stay at home. That's one thing. The second thing, this international rules-based order. I mean, that sounds like a political scientist phrase, but if you unpack it, we're talking about respect for borders, respect for sovereignty. That matters to every American. Respect for freedom of navigation. That's essential for our economy that depends on trade. Respect for human rights. Respect for international agreements. Russia hates all that stuff. It's important for us. It's important for all of our European allies. And China is watching to see, are we really willing to defend those values?
And if we don't show that we are willing to defend those values, what are the consequences?
Then I think the chance of China making a miscalculation like Russia did goes up.
Are you talking about Taiwan?
Taiwan, South China Seas, a variety of other places. We don't have to have a conflict. It's not inevitable that we have a conflict with China. In fact, I think if U.S., Canada, Europe, our Pacific allies, all, when you combine the economic power and the diplomatic power of all those nations, we can hold China accountable, force them to live up to the agreements they've signed, respect for sovereignty, international law. But if we don't, then they are going to continue seeking leverage in Africa, the Middle East, and other places.
Absolutely. I mean, he's absolutely spot on there, as you'd expect. And Russia are looking on with very keen eyes as to what goes on in Ukraine. And this will, in turn, inform their activity concerning Taiwan and all these other areas and that Hodges was talking about. And so if America's weak on Ukraine, then that will embolden China with Taiwan. And somebody said, I talked about this in a previous video where someone in America had said, hey, we shouldn't be, I think it might have been a Republican politician, possibly, been questioning, hey, we shouldn't be spending money on Ukraine. We should be thinking more about Taiwan. And there was an article written, and many people have said the same kind of thing, which is the best way to deal with Taiwan is for Ukraine to prevail and for the US to be strong on Ukraine. If the US are strong on Ukraine and Ukraine prevail and Russia loses, China ain't going to do squat about Taiwan.
So are you saying then that what happens in Ukraine will determine the future relationships with China?
You said it much better than I did.
I didn't. I tell you I didn't.
And so here we have the last segment from Hodges that I'm going to share.
Any unpopular insights you want to share with us now?
Well, look, when the Russians made their miscalculations, it was based on overconfidence on their part that they would just be able to blow into Ukraine. There was no way the Ukrainians were going to fight back. Secondly, we, the West, had not done a whole lot to give them cause for concern. I mentioned the previous times where we had not responded. And then, of course, in the U.S., we were a mess. You know, the former president denying he'd ever lost the election, January 6th, all of this embarrassing rupture in American society, plus the way the war in Afghanistan had come to an end. I mean, you could almost imagine the Kremlin saying, these guys they're not going to do anything. Germany was still building Nord Stream 2 up until late in 2021.
It's a really important thing to say, to look at how the Kremlin would have seen America at the time. 2020, the beginning of 2020, denying the election, the insurrection. I mean, discord has been sown there, or discord is evident there. Germany seemed to be in the pocket of Russia to some degree and completely reliant on Russian hydrocarbons. There's elements of control over elements of Europe. You've got Hungary, you've got different nations to different degrees, you know, in the sphere of influence of the Kremlin. And then you had the inactivity in 2014, but also before the annexation of Crimea and Donbass, you had Georgia, Chechnya, and the lack of unity from the West and lack of robust response. And then you're looking at how Biden, which I know that was kind of a culmination of what had been taking place, and you know the wheels have been put in motion before Biden's administration came in, but they still handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan badly, and then that included all allies like the UK as well, and that all went wrong, and so the Kremlin are going to be looking at this situation, and go, yeah, good time to do this.
And so for me, this is the biggest lesson, is that it's what we already knew. You can't appease when you're dealing with a brutal autocracy like Russia. They only respect strength. And I know I sound like a scratch record, but it's a fact. They've never been anything but an empire for almost 5 centuries. And until they are defeated on the battlefield, there will never be a reckoning, and whoever comes after Putin will be something like him, just with a less effective military.
Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Indeed, it's been a pleasure to listen to that. I think, his analysis is pretty much spot on for what it's worth. Having my endorsement, which is worth approximately nothing, I guess. But there you go. So that was a lot of Ben Hodges, but I think those ideas are well worth discussing in the threads below. And it's always good to get that kind of level of analysis from someone that, as Dom Nichols would say, knows his onions. And he does indeed know his onions. Anyway, thank you. Really appreciate all the support. Thank you so much to those of you who have supported. Nick Stanton, Vicky Stewart, Amar, so many people on Buy Me a Coffee. I really, really appreciate all of your wonderful support. Lawrence22, all of those people who know who you are, thank you so much. You are truly wonderful. And I will get on with thinking about what I'm going to talk about in my next extra video. I know perfectly well what I'm going to talk about. I've got a list as long as my arm. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.